The summer of 65 AD pressed down on Rome like a furnace. The marble streets shimmered in the heat, and even the fountains of the Forum seemed to hiss and steam. Yet inside the Palatine Palace, the air was thicker still, heavy with incense, sweat, and dread. Behind a veil of embroidered linen lay the woman who had ruled not only the empire's court, but the emperor's heart. Poppaea Sabina, empress, enchantress, survivor. Her beauty had been legend. Hair that glowed like sunlight on honey, a gaze sharp enough to silence senators mid-sentence, a smile that could unmake a man's ambitions in a heartbeat. She had seduced her way to power, maneuvered through a nest of enemies, and secured her place beside the Emperor of Rome. But now she was dying. Her breath came ragged. The silk sheets beneath her were stained with sweat and blood. She was heavy with child, a child who would never be born. The cause was whispered by every trembling slave in the palace. Nero had struck her. Some said it was a quarrel that boiled into rage. Others swore it was a single brutal kick delivered in the emperor's volcanic fury. The historians would later argue, but the result was beyond debate. The unborn child perished within her womb, and within days, Poppaea Sabina was gone. The city held its breath. Nero's grief was not the grief of a man. It was the grief of a god betrayed by the fates. He raged, he wept, he howled in his chambers like a beast. He decreed a funeral of unprecedented splendor. The empress's body was embalmed in rare spices. Ivory statues of her lined the roads, and senators, cowed by his fury, declared her goddess. Perfumed smoke rose across Rome, drowning the city in the scent of mourning. But none of it soothed him. To the outside world, Nero was the most powerful man alive, ruler of an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. Yet in the silence of his chambers, he was a man stripped bare, obsessed, unmoored, and haunted. Poppaea had been more than wife. She had been mirror and muse, the vessel into which he poured his boundless hunger for beauty, for glory, for love twisted into possession. Without her, he was not whole. And then came the whisper. There was a boy whose features were uncannily like hers. Pale skin, delicate face, mournful eyes, the kind of beauty that in Rome could be either blessing or curse. His name was Sporus. No one remembers his origins. Perhaps he was the son of a freedman, perhaps a slave noticed for his resemblance to the dead empress. But what mattered was that when Nero laid eyes on him, he did not see a boy. He saw a possibility. The decision came swiftly with the cruelty of divine madness. If Rome would not give him back Poppaea, he would create her anew. He ordered the child taken, stripped not only of his freedom, but of his very body. In the surgeon's chamber, under the cold hands of Rome's physicians, Sporus was cut, castrated, transformed. The boy's cries echoed against the stone, but no one listened. He was no longer himself. He was no longer allowed to be a boy at all. He was Poppaea reborn, a living ghost fashioned from flesh. When Nero next appeared in public, he did not walk alone. Draped in silks, adorned with jewels once worn by the dead empress, Sporus stood at his side. Homme gesped. Senators hid their disgust behind masks of obedience. The people whispered in horror, and Nero smiled, triumphant in his delusion. This was not love. This was not mourning. This was grief twisted into madness, power without boundary. The emperor of Rome had taken a child and reshaped him into the likeness of his lost wife. And in that moment, the empire itself seemed to stagger, for its master had crossed into nightmare, remaking reality, bending flesh and spirit to his will. Rome could scarcely believe what it was seeing. The city that had once crowned Julius Caesar, the empire that stretched from the sands of Egypt to the moors of Britannia, now gathered in the forum to witness a spectacle so grotesque it would echo for centuries. Nero was to be wed again. The bride appeared first, veiled in white silk embroidered with gold, jewels glittering in her hair, her small figure dwarfed by the weight of imperial finery. At a distance, the crowd murmured, some whispering the name Poppaea. For a heartbeat, it was as though the dead empress had returned to walk among them. But when the boy lowered his eyes, when the veil slipped enough to reveal his pale, delicate face, the truth spread like a contagion through the masses. It was Sporus, the boy Nero had taken, cut, reshaped. Now he stood dressed as a woman, the empress resurrected not by the gods, but by a surgeon's knife and an emperor's obsession. The priest recited the ancient words, their voices trembling. The laurel-crowned emperor slipped the bridal veil over Sporus's head, kissed him before the altar of Jupiter, and called him Sabina, Poppaea's name. Senators bowed. Praetorians stood stiff as statues, and the people of Rome, shocked into silence, realized they were witnessing not marriage, but a ritual of grief made monstrous. From that day, Sporus lived as Nero's wife. He rode beside the emperor in his golden chariot, sat at his side during banquets, and appeared in public wearing the gowns and jewels of the dead empress. Courtiers addressed him as Augusta. Even the official records dared not contradict the emperor's fantasy. Yet behind the spectacle was a nightmare too cruel for words. Each morning, attendants dressed Sporus like a doll, powdering his face, arranging his hair in intricate styles, draping him in the garments of a woman he had never been. At night, he was forced to share Nero's bed, a parody of intimacy enacted under the gaze of a man who no longer distinguished love from possession. The boy lived trapped in a role carved from another's corpse. Every gesture, every word, was an echo of Poppaea. His own identity was erased, replaced by the memory of a woman who no longer lived. And still, Rome watched. Some sneered, others whispered that Nero had gone mad, but none dared intervene. The empire bent beneath his delusion. But beneath the laughter and pageantry, cracks widened in the emperor's mask. For though Nero paraded his new bride with triumph, he was haunted. In Sporus's eyes, he sometimes caught a flicker of defiance, a silent reminder that no matter how much silk he draped over the boy, no matter how many jewels he fastened in his hair, this was not Poppaea. And so his obsession deepened. The emperor of Rome, master of legions, builder of palaces, patron of the arts, had bound his fate to a child mutilated to fill the void left by a murdered wife. What began as grief was curdling into paranoia, a madness that would soon drag the empire itself into ruin. The marriage of shadows had bound Sporus to Nero, but had not healed the emperor's wound. If anything, it tore it wider. For though he paraded his new wife through the streets, though he dined with him as Augusta, though he lay beside him at night and whispered Poppaea's name into the silence, Nero could not silence the truth gnawing at his soul. Poppaea was dead, and Rome knew it. Whispers spread like a disease. In the bathhouses, in the markets, in the taverns where common men drank sour wine, they spoke of the emperor who had killed his pregnant wife, then mutilated a boy to replace her. The laughter of the mob was the one thing Nero could not bear, and so he drowned it in spectacles. Bread and circuses became his weapons. Gladiators fought beneath gilded awnings while musicians played. Wild beasts from Africa were unleashed upon the arena, tearing prisoners limb from limb to the delighted screams of the crowd. But Nero, ever the performer, wanted more. He fancied himself a god of art, an immortal voice sent to awe the world. And so he sang. Picture the theater packed with thousands, senators, and slaves alike, forbidden to leave while the emperor performed. Nero, draped in shimmering robes, stood upon the stage with lyre in hand, his voice straining through endless verses of tragedies and epics. Sporus was always there, seated beside the imperial seat, forced to smile, forced to applaud. The boy's silence became part of the performance, his very existence a symbol of the emperor's defiance of reality. But as Nero indulged in his fantasies, the empire decayed. Revolts erupted in Gaul. The treasury bled dry from spectacles and palaces. The legions, once loyal, began to grumble. And always, behind Nero, moved the frail figure of Sporus, a living reminder that their emperor had slipped into madness. In private, Nero's paranoia grew. He saw betrayal in every face, treason in every gesture. He had already murdered his stepbrother Britannicus, poisoned in front of guests at a banquet. He had kicked his own mother, Agrippina, to death after failed attempts at drowning and stabbing her. Now, even his closest advisors were not safe. Seneca, the philosopher who had once tutored him, was forced to open his own veins and bleed out into a bath. One by one, those who had once guided him were silenced. And all the while, Sporus endured, a child carved into the likeness of a dead empress. He became the one constant in the emperor's unraveling world. Some whispered that Sporus showed no emotion at all, that he had learned to wear a mask as perfect as any marble statue. Others said his eyes betrayed him, that behind the painted lashes smoldered a quiet hatred, a longing for an end that would never come. Yet Nero clung to him desperately. At banquets, he would lift a goblet and toast to my Sabina, return to me. At night, he would cradle the boy as if holding Poppaea herself, weeping into his hair, begging the gods to make the illusion real. And in the morning, he would rise and order another execution, another parade, another song to drown the silence in his heart. The empire trembled on the edge of collapse, but Nero saw only the ghost he had remade. In Sporus, he thought he had conquered death. In truth, he had only exposed the depth of his own ruin. The question was no longer if Nero would fall, but when, and what would become of the boy bound to him when Rome finally turned on its emperor. The year was 68 AD, and Rome had begun to turn on its master. The city that once cheered Nero's spectacles now whispered of rebellion. Governors in distant provinces rose in defiance. Legions declared their loyalty to new leaders, and the Senate, long cowed into silence, began to stir with treachery. For Nero, reality was collapsing. The empire he had ruled with cruelty and theater was slipping from his grasp. Crowds once dazzled by his voice now mocked him in secret. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had been bought with gold, began to drift away as the treasury ran dry. And the Senate, emboldened by whispers of revolution, declared him a public enemy. In the marble halls of the palace, where shadows clung to every torch, Nero raged like a wounded beast. He saw betrayal in every face, treason in every whisper. His friends abandoned him one by one, fleeing before the empire's wrath could consume them. But Sporus remained. Imagine him, then, dressed still in the silks of an empress, seated silently at Nero's side as the world fell apart. What did he feel? Fear? Resignation? Or perhaps a grim satisfaction, knowing that the man who had stolen his youth, who had carved away his very body to build a ghost, was now crumbling into ruin? Nero would not let him go. Even in his final days, he clung to the boy as though he were the last tether to a world that no longer existed. My Sabina, he called him, stroking his hair, whispering desperate plans. They would flee Rome. They would find sanctuary in Egypt, where Nero could live as an artist king, adored by the people. Or they would retreat to the east, where legions still remembered the emperor's favor. Anything but surrender. but fate had already sealed his end. On the night of June 9th, 68 AD, Nero fled the city. He disguised himself in rags, his face hidden by a hood, accompanied only by a handful of loyal freedmen, and Sporus, the emperor of the known world, who once strutted through gilded theaters and marble forums, now stumbled through back alleys like a hunted criminal. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance. The Praetorians no longer his guard, but his pursuers. They reached the villa of Phaon, one of Nero's freedmen, outside the city walls. There, as dawn crept across the sky, Nero collapsed into despair. He heard the Senate's decree. He was to be executed in the ancient fashion, stripped, beaten, and strangled in public. The thought of humiliation was worse than death. In that villa, Nero wept and muttered to himself, repeating the same phrase over and over. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. The voice that once commanded amphitheaters cracked into sobs. He begged those around him to strike the killing blow, but none would raise the blade. Even in ruin, the shadow of imperial power was too great. And so Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, the man who had killed his mother, his wife, and mutilated a boy to replace her, pressed a dagger to his own throat. His hand shook, cowardice chaining him in his final act. At last, a freedman drove the weapon home. With a gasp, a shudder, and a smear of blood upon the marble floor, the emperor was gone. The empire exhaled. Rome had rid itself of its monster. But for Sporus, the nightmare was not over. He stood among the wreckage of Nero's final hours, no longer bound to the emperor, yet still bound by what had been done to him. The empire that once mocked his existence now saw him as a living relic of a fallen tyrant. And in the turbulent years that followed, others would claim him, use him, and drag him deeper into Rome's cruel theater. The boy who had once been forced to play a bride would soon find himself cast in an even darker role. Nero was gone, but Rome did not return a peace. The empire convulsed in chaos, each general clawing for the throne. In this storm of ambition, one figure remained curiously adrift: Sporus, the boy who had been forced into a dead woman's skin. At first, he was a trophy. Otho, one of Nero's companions in decadence and now a claimant to imperial power, took Sporus into his household. To Otho, the boy was not a victim, but a prize, proof of his closeness to the late emperor, a jewel plucked from Nero's ruined palace. Once again, Sporus was dressed in silks, paraded before courtiers, forced to smile, forced to play the role of empress. For Otho, it was not enough to rule Rome. He wished to hold Nero's ghost in his hands. But Otho's reign was brief. Within months, he fell to the sword in civil war. Sporus passed again into the hands of another man, Vitellius, who seized the throne with blood and fire. Unlike Otho, Vitellius saw no beauty in the boy. To him, Sporus was a grotesque curiosity, a living emblem of Rome's sickness. And where Nero had forced him into marriage, Vitellius devised a darker humiliation. He announced that Sporus would be made to play the role of bride once more, but not to a man. To death itself, before the eyes of Rome, Vitellius planned to stage a parody of a wedding. Sporus, dressed again as a bride, would be led to the arena, veiled and trembling, to be married to a gladiator enacting the part of Pluto, god of the underworld. And when the vows were spoken, when the torches were lit and the crowd roared with laughter, the gladiator would rape him in the sand, a ritual sacrifice to mock Nero's madness and destroy the last fragment of his legacy. It was theater of the cruelest kind, Rome's eternal appetite for spectacle devouring the boy one final time. But Sporus would not play this part. After years of silence, years of endurance, he chose his own ending. Before Vitellius could drag him to the arena, Sporus took his own life. Ancient sources say he slit his wrists, others that he suffocated himself. Whatever the method, the meaning was clear. He would not be paraded again. He would not be the doll, the bride, the ghost. He would claim, in death, what Rome had stolen from him in life, his final act of will. And so the story of Sporus ends not in marriage, not in ceremony, but in defiance. A boy castrated to soothe an emperor's grief, dressed in silks to replace a dead empress, paraded as a queen and mocked as a slave, found only one escape: the silence of death. History remembers Nero as a monster, the man who killed his mother, who burned his city, who sang while Rome wept. But in the shadows of his cruelty lingers the memory of Sporus, not as an empress, not as a bride, but as a child crushed beneath the weight of one man's obsession, his life twisted into a grotesque performance for an empire drunk on spectacle. When we think of Rome's grandeur, its marble, its legions, its endless conquests, we must also remember him, the boy who was forced to live as a ghost, the bride of shadows, the final victim of an emperor who could not bear to let the dead rest. And in his silence, Sporus whispers across the centuries a truth that Rome itself tried to forget: that power without mercy is madness, and that the greatest cruelty of all is to strip a human being of the right to be themselves.